Good morning, John. You're well known as an eminent medieval historian and as an ALP councillor and Mayor of Ashfield Council, not to mention a founder of the Ashfield and District Historical Society. You're possibly less well known as the owner of this beautifully restored Victorian house in Kensington Road, Summerhill, where you've kindly invited us this morning. I hope you can tell us something about these 4 different roles in this interview.
Well, thank you, Bernadette. It's very kind of you to come, and I'm most flattered to be so described.
Well, first things first, when and where were you born?
In Surrey Hills, Melbourne, an embarrassing number of years ago, 76 years ago.
And what are your most vivid memories from your childhood in Surrey Hills in Melbourne?
Not so many memories of that house in Chester Street, which is where it was. Surrey Hills then was an outer suburb. It was the end of the Wattle Park tram line, and it was opposite the Wattle Park Reserve. And in the early days, tramline companies used to build a park at the end of their line to encourage people to come out of it. So they got some extra traffic during the day, which balanced the peak hour traffic into the city. And the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board, which ran the tramway system under Major General Risson, built this park, and we lived very close to it. So that was all very pleasant, but my most vivid memories are at Shoreham, because in 1948 my father bought a 3-acre property at Shoreham, which is 50 miles south in the Mornington Peninsula, and he bought it because Chifley had instituted a system where you paid £100 per acre, and he bought 3 acres, cost him £300, and he built a 5-row shed on it, and got I think one of them was a war hut, and he just added to it. And he made a lovely property down. The beach was terrific, and we used to play in the bushes and ferns and creeks, and there were no houses there at all. And we used to make sand castles on the beach, and as the tide come in, we'd have to build the walls higher and higher, and there was no one else there. If we saw somebody else on that beach, we had the feeling, what's this person doing here? You know, it was our beach, and it was absolutely scenic between Honeysuckle Point and Shoreham Beach. It was just a lovely environment. And the thing I loved most were the winter holidays, when my cousins would come down, 2 pretty girls and a boy, and we would have a lovely time. The fathers, who were a bit harder to put up with, would all go back to work and leave the 2 mothers. And they were marvellous. They were great friends, and, you know, they invented fantastic things to do. We used to read books by candlelight and all that sort of thing, and the howling wind and rain outside made it all so snug. So I remember all that very well.
Tell us about your education, John.
Oh, well, I went to... My parents wanted me to go to a private school, and they sent me to Camberwell Grammar, which we used to call Campbell Grandma School, after the migrant camp at Campbell. And it was a bit of a potty school in those days, but one great virtue of it was that it could hire teachers who had no qualification, and it hired lots of Viennese doctors, German doctors with legal degrees, but they couldn't operate as lawyers out here because we never recognised their qualifications. And they were men of marvellous learning, and Doc White taught us Latin and French, and Dr. Coffield taught us Latin and history, and they were excellent disciplinarians, and they encouraged us to go visit them at weekends, which was very pleasant too. So it was a funny school, but it had some advantages which are no longer possible, you know, because of these learned immigrants who ended up being teachers. We also had Reginald Kirby as a teacher, and Reginald Kirby is quite a celebrated novelist, and he was another one who didn't have any particular teaching qualifications, but he was a very fluent and learned man, and these people remain in your memory as having shaped you, you know. So, but otherwise, Campbell Grammar School was a bit odd.
Why did you pursue higher education at a time when it was unusual to do so?
Oh, well, I mean, I didn't pursue it for its own sake. It was just the easiest way to go on studying the things I liked studying. And I loved history, particularly ancient history. And I remember being told that if I got a good result at school, then I could get a scholarship and go on to the university. And I thought that was a great thing to do. And I ended up getting a Commonwealth scholarship and a senior government scholarship because I came top of my school that year. I was dux of the school, as they called it in those days. So I'm still up there on honour boards and things like that. And it just seemed the most interesting thing to do. And so I just followed what that all meant and went up to Melbourne University when it was the only university in town. And again, there were people there who were very memorable people who are possibly not so available now, you know.
What drew you to medieval history?
Oh, well, as I said, I loved antiquity and ancient history, but in the second year we had a teacher from England called Molly Gibbs, who was a very strange person. She'd been a communist during the 40s and had not done so well in the academic line, but she was a very celebrated historian. She'd written books on feudalism and edited St Paul's charters, and was a very unusual but stimulating kind of person. And I took her course, and she gave me as an essay in the first term, what use did the Middle Ages make of antiquity? And I got really into that. I thought that was a terrific subject. And I ended up becoming more interested in the Middle Ages that made use of antiquity than in antiquity itself. And I don't know why, because of course in antiquity you've got Julius Caesar, you've got the Roman Empire, you've got the Persian Wars, you've got all those big interesting things. I suppose it was in the Middle Ages I hadn't really heard of anything, and it just struck me as amazing that these people in the 12th century would use texts that were 1,000 years old, and then they would write elaborate commentaries to sort of bring them up to date and make them explainable to their students and things like that. And that's still my field, you know, so I suppose I just got interested in that. Sidetracked.
I understand you studied in Canada for some years. Did any differences between Canada and Australia strike you there?
Canada, yes. Well, when I finished my BA, the next thing to do was to do a PhD. And you could either do it at home or you could do it overseas. And the two favourite overseas places were Canada and the UK, because you could get a Commonwealth scholarship that would take you there and pay your fees. And there was a great deal of competition to get to the UK, of course. And I decided to go to Canada because at Toronto they had an institution called the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, which had been founded by Etienne Gilson, a great French medievalist. And I thought, well, that'd be an interesting place. And it was very close to New York and all the great libraries in Chicago and such places. And I think I got in because I was somebody who actually wanted to go there, whereas all the others wanted to go to the UK, and failing that they would go to Canada. But they somehow, I suppose, thought it was nice that somebody wanted to go to Canada. So I set off by a most ancient plane, which had to stop 3 or 4 times before it got to Toronto. And it was, I think, a propeller plane, and it just had a little corridor and 2 seats either side. And that was quite an adventure in those days to get air traffic. And I arrived in Toronto very cold, and of course had my first proper winter with snow and all the rest of it. And Gail came over, the lady I eventually married, a couple of months after that. So it was a good experience, and I found the Canadians warm and independent. And in those days, Australia was a slavish follower of the US. But Canada wasn't. It was closer, but it was autonomous, and it took its own views, and everybody had an opinion on these things. And I remember I met some West Indians there who were studying at Toronto in the same way, and they were appalled at how unaware I was of, or Gail and I were, of politics. And they said, "How come your government didn't send a protest about the massacre at Sharpeville in South Africa?" And I'd heard neither of that nor of any protest. And I realised that I'd been brought up in a sort of vacuum in Australia with no real political information and relevance. And I learnt a lot in Canada from all that. It was not only the Canadians, but it was the people that came there, because it was a much more celebrated place to go than Australia was. Nobody came to Australia in those days, unless, a teacher got hired at a university or something like that. And of course I was there when Kennedy was shot, and it was a marvellous country. It was just huge and vast, and we took a little trip to Moosonee, which was a Hudson Bay Company town way up north. It was only accessible by train, and the remoteness of all that really struck me. I thought this is an enormous country, and I've subsequently been back and seen all the things I couldn't afford to see there, and it is a most stupendously scenic country. But I think the major difference was that it was much more like America. It had much more advanced universities, and a number of them, and a much more developed political profile. And yet it was not just a slavish copier of the United States. It was its own country. And because it had the British background, it was different. And one of my earliest friends in Canada thought I was terrific because he kept saying I'm British. And I kept saying I'm not British, I'm Australian. "Oh, that's British to me," he said. "I'd give the shirt off my back to a Briton." And we had a honeymoon. We got married in Canada, and we had a honeymoon in his place at Gananoque in the midst of winter, as we took frozen trains up to Quebec, where we had the rest of our honeymoon. That was great too, to go to French Canada. Again, something you never experienced in Australia. And I remember when we got there, we didn't really speak French adequately. We therefore spoke English. And they were very worked up against the English speakers because they thought they were trying to tyrannise over them and ignore them and so on. But as soon as they realised we came from Australia, they were warm and friendly. It's all right to speak English if you didn't come from Canada, But all that made a very big impression on us. And when we came back to Australia, we were so aware of the dreadful accent everybody had. We'd sort of not heard it for years, and it seemed to have changed very little and was just as isolated as it always had been, whereas Canada was really part of the world,
Yeah,
and
Canada
so
had
close.
taken
It was.
no part in the Vietnam War,
That's right. They had
and it was a
taken
big shock. We never sort of thought about what Australia was doing while we were there. big shock to come back and discover that, we'd been part of it.
Yeah, that's right. The Canadians, as I say, they took an independent approach to politics. They refused to follow the US into Vietnam, and thus saved themselves all sorts of dilemmas and problems. Whereas we sent rookies, new recruits into Vietnam, young kids, more or less just out of school. So we liked that. We thought that was...
So when was it exactly that you returned to Australia, John?
Oh, well...
It's the late 60s, about 67.
69 or...
No, a bit earlier than that. About 67.
67, was it?
We were there 4 years and
Yeah, we were there 63 to 67. Yeah, nice.
Well, very late 60s.
We have to get our dates in, especially as you're a historian. So tell us about your first job.
Oh, well, I taught in Canada, temporary jobs, tutoring and things like that. That was good because you had the chance to develop a relationship with the students, and the other teachers were very welcoming and supportive and so on. But they were only part-time jobs. First job was at the University of Sydney, teaching medieval history. And again, you felt you were right out in the cold, miles from anywhere. But the university was very good in those days. It had no requirements at all. All you had to do was to make sure you never raped any students or caused a furore of one sort or another. Other than that, you did what you liked in your class. And so long as you kept the students interested, they didn't care how many students you had or, they left it all to you. And I used to be in my room all day. I would have my lunch in my room, open to any students who wanted to come in. And I never went to the staff club, and my only contact with the other staff members was the morning and afternoon tea. And in those days, they always had morning and afternoon tea, and you'd go up and you'd chat away. And I can still remember some of the conversations we had in the staff room with eminent scholars who have now long since faded from my memory. And I remember Graham Harrison telling me, John, in the 16th century, the Spanish knew everything and were everywhere. They could hear a pin drop. And I thought, how vivid. And there was a professor of ancient history, Geoffrey Evans, who said, after the fall of Nineveh in 606 BC, everything was a footnote. So you got some very stimulating conversations. But other than going to morning and afternoon tea and not causing a furore with the students, you were left to yourself. And I thought that was terrific. I was very lucky to have had that chance to teach in that way.
And what were your particular research interests?
Well, they followed on from that teacher, Molly Gibbs, in Melbourne, and I became particularly interested in the use the Middle Ages made of classical learning. That's to say the trivium and the quadrivium. The three arts of the trivium were grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, or logic. And the quadrivium were scientific subjects, astronomy and music and things like that. And for some reason I became interested in rhetoric because rhetoric was so absolutely classical. And at the time, people said, oh no, the Middle Ages, they weren't interested in rhetoric, they were interested in truth, Christian truth. And I began looking through the manuscripts and I found tons of evidence. I looked at 1,250 manuscripts in 248 libraries, and I found that there was tons of evidence that the Middle Ages really did study the classical works of rhetoric, Cicero, and mainly, of course, works that we think are puerile and not significant today. The Rhetorica ad Herennium, which the Middle Ages thought was written by Cicero, but in fact it's nowadays thought not to have been. And Cicero's earliest work, the De Inventione, on invention, which is one of the 5 parts of rhetoric. And those works today are spurned. They're just kid stuff. But in the Middle Ages, they were very important because the Middle Ages wanted to learn from antiquity, not just about it, whereas we like to learn about it, but not from it. We'd never go to the Ad Horennium and say, how does it teach us something useful? And yet our advertising programs make a great deal of use of the things that were first set out in the Ad Horennium on persuasion and things of that sort. So I just got more and more into that. And visiting 248 libraries was not the work of a day. And in those days you went away in May, mainly because there were 3 semesters and May was a free month. It was no teaching. And it was when they had all the big conferences overseas. And you'd do a tour. You'd go to the Kalamazoo conference and look at any American library you had to. Then you go to London and look at the British Library, or British Museum Library as it was then. And then you'd go to Milan or Göttingen or Munich, and you'd do a tour and check out libraries and things like that. And then in those days you could take a sabbatical year, which meant your 7th year you could go do research. And that's when you visited all these little towns. And there were some marvellous experiences there. You'd come to a little town and they'd say, the manuscript room doesn't open today. It only opens every second day. And you'd say, yeah, but I've got to go to Sydney tonight. They'd say, well, we'll go get the book you want, but you'll have to sit somewhere else. And I remember once in the town of Limoges, they sat me on a little desk above which was the French word renseignement, which meant information. And so people kept coming up to me and saying, how do I do this and whereabouts is that? And I'd have to say, I'm not working at this library, you know. So there were lots of very interesting experiences. And I once thought of writing a book that would tell you how to get to the library, when its hours of requesting a manuscript are open and when they're not, because they had libraries that would be open 9 to 5, but then they would have requiesta. Requiesta is the time you can ask for something, and you might only be able to do that between 10 and 12 in the morning, and you could study in the afternoon, but you had to have made your requiesta in the morning. So there were lots of strange little things, and I thought, somebody else may need to do all this, and I should write it all up, but I never did.
Oh, well, I'm sure Lonely Planet would be very interested.
Yeah, that's right, how to get to the major
specialised niche.
manuscript rooms. Yeah, well,
Yes.
they probably would.
I'd pursue it, they would. So you've hinted at changes, but I'd like to ask, how did universities change during your career?
Oh, well, they changed greatly because somehow they got more calculating and they abolished classes less than 50, they abolished tutorials in the 3rd year, and towards the end of my time they even began to introduce things called performance appraisals. You had to go and meet somebody in the department and they'd say, what have you done? What are you going to do next year? And you'd say, I'm going to do this and this and this. And then next year they'd meet you and say, well, you said you were going to do this, this and this, but you only did this. What about the other 2? And you could get satisfactory, unsatisfactory or commendable. And if you got 2 unsatisfactories, they'd give you the sack. And I thought this was an absurd waste of time, and I resigned, I was 63 or something, and I had diabetes by then, and I became blank in a couple of classes because I had low blood sugars, and the kids were very good. They rushed out and got a Coca-Cola and came back. But I thought, I can't submit them to this. So in 2003, I retired. But the university by that time had changed totally. everyone was strictly supervised, and
The teachers, you mean?
the teachers, a burden of bureaucratic requirements had been placed on them, and the non-teachers ran the show. When I went to the University of Sydney, it was 97% teaching staff and 3% were just administrators. And when I finished, half the people there were administrators. And the teachers, I thought, got very raw deals, and they would not hire proper teachers. They would use postgraduate students on temporary arrangements. They'd pay them for 9 months and then employ them next year, but they had to go 3 months without a salary and get trumpery wages and things like that. And, you know, I thought, well, look, they shouldn't do that. They should take a university job as worth, let's say, 8 hours of teaching a week. A half teaching job would be worth 4. A quarter teaching job would be worth 2. And it would be much better to employ people for 2 or 4 or 6 hours than to hire these poor postgraduates and then throw them away at the end. So, whereas in my day, if you taught, you were a full-time teacher. You got your sabbaticals every 7 years. You received, every trip I made, I paid a third. The university paid a third, and the other third came from tax cuts. So, you know, you could travel all over the world and do all the things you had to do, and the administration was very benevolent. You had to apply in advance and say, I want to go on leave such and such a time. And there was a committee that would look at it and eventually give you approval. And one year I sent in my request and they never replied. And the former professor of history was called John Ward, and he became the vice-chancellor, and he was killed in a train crash.
Remember that?
Later on. And 25 people rang me that day and said, am I dead? And I said, no, it was the other John Ward. He was John M. Ward, and I was John O. Ward. But he was a marvellous person in so many ways. If you had any trouble, you dropped a note to John Ward and he fixed it. So I dropped him a note. I said, oh, look, you know, I haven't got me approval to go on leave. The next day came a letter, approval granted. John M. Ward, you know. And in other words, he was a benevolent dictator. He ran the show. There were no departmental meetings or anything like that. But he did it from the point of view of the best interests of the staff and the students. And he was a great man, and I really enjoyed the time when there were 2 John Wards, one at the top of the department and one at the bottom.
I see from the University of Sydney's website that despite retiring in 2003, that you've just mentioned, you are now an Honorary Associate with the Centre for Medieval Studies. What's your role there?
Oh, not much. For a while, you would help them teach. You would give a fortnight's lectures here and there, or you might supervise some postgraduate students or mark some work or something like that. And the reason they wanted you to stay on was that anything you published, any books, any articles, went to their credit. And in the end it became quite a benevolent arrangement. You could use the university as your authority when you were writing to people to go places or do things, and you didn't have to do much. They gave you a room with a computer in it. You had to share it with others and things like that. And you have to apply for it each year, and you have to tell them you're still active and you still do things and that sort of stuff. So it just ground on, and somehow or other you become less and less relevant to them teaching, because new people come and they don't know you, and the unions get very shirty about honorary teachers giving lectures for nothing, and they say that's an abuse and it could be opened up to deny people proper wages and proper jobs. So the tendency to give free lectures was frowned upon, and we don't really do that anymore. So it just means it's a bit easier to go on doing your work because you're known as from the University of Sydney rather than just being Joe Blow in the suburbs, you know.
Well, that's a nice segue into changing to the next area of our discussion. Why did you settle in Summerhill?
Well, we first settled in Lane Cove. We took over a house for a colleague who was on sabbatical leave. And Lane Cove was very remote. You know, you had to have a car, and the buses stopped at 6 p.m. Really wasn't very pleasant. So we decided to buy a house, and we found that most banks would only lend you money for a recent house, whereas we sort of looked around and we wanted a place that was near a railway station and not too far from the city. I don't know how we came to Summerhill.
Oh, my mother saw an ad in the paper, dripping with iron lace, try Summerhill. And it was also another ad, actually, when we bought this house. Balmain buyers, try Summerhill.
Yes.
Balmain was no good for us because John, in his whole life, has never owned a car, and we had to be near a railway station. That was it. And
Yeah,
coming
Balmain
from Melbourne,
was-
to Sydney, having grown up in Melbourne and spent the years in Canada, in Toronto, which is a beautiful tramway city, it was essential we be by the railway line, and
Or
we
because they got rid of the trams.
yes, and we had saved up by then, a couple of years later, $1,100.
No, 11,000. Oh no, 1,100.
$1,100, and that was 10%. You had to have 10% to be able to bid, and the banks hated you going to auctions because they wouldn't guarantee your money. But you had to have, whatever it was, you had to have 10% of. So we could only bid first, or only look at places that were about 11,000.
But most banks would only lend you on a recent house in a more fashionable
Yes.
suburb. Was to get an old house, the only bank that would lend you money was the Commonwealth Bank. And as Gail said, her mother saw an ad for Summerhill, so we went there to Carrington Street, and there was a little gem of a house. It was small,
Still the prettiest house in Sydney.
but it was full of
26
Victorian
homes.
style. It had a complete set of verandas with lace. It had stained glass in the front door, and it just really took our fancy. So we found we could buy it.
It was 14.
Yes, it was
1,500.
14,500, and my father lent me $4,000, which was the difference between our deposit, what the bank would lend, and the cost of the house. So we ended up buying that. And in those days it was a street full of migrants, Yugoslavs and Greeks and Italians, and that was a
Polish people.
Polish, yeah, that was an interesting
Do
kind of
you read
environment. Whereas the suburbs like Lane Cove were full of
English.
English speakers, and you never met the migrants in those suburbs.
Well, they were migrants. The English were migrants.
Well,
A lot
I
of
mean,
them-
you never got the
No.
colourful recent migrants. I mean, there were women in our street that never spoke English in their life because they were Yugoslavs, and their kids spoke it, and their husband did because he had to work, but they never learnt anything, you know. So it was an interesting street, and a 5-minute walk to the train. It had a few double-decker buses coming by too in those days, but mainly it was the train. But of course, to get to the University of Sydney, the trains were not much good. You had to get, I think it was a 465. It ran every hour. It was pretty hopeless. But it was an old double-decker in those days, so it wasn't so good from that point of view. Whereas now, where we are now is marvellous. We're 5 minutes from the train. We got all the buses along Parramatta Road, 3 or 4 minutes away, and we got the tram at Taverners Hill. You know, so you've got the best of everything now. But now, in those days, Carrington Street was on the south side of the railway. We're now on the north side between the railway and Parramatta Road, so we're a bit more central.
Tell us about restoring this beautiful house in Kensington Road.
Well, in those days, Summerhill was a slum full of boarding houses, and the council, because it was afraid the houses would fall to pieces, became very keen on putting up flat blocks. But they put up the cheapest type, 3-storey walk-ups, because if you kept it under 3 stories you didn't need a lift. So it was a mixture of old houses which had been turned into boarding houses and 3-storey walk-ups. And when we went to Carrington Street, it hadn't been invaded by 3-storey walk-ups at all. It was full of little cottages. Anyway, the one we had was too small for our 3 kids and us. So we looked around, we saw a good place in Glebe and a good place in Lewisham, and we found this house here in Summerhill, which, as Gail said, had an advertisement, Balmain buyers try Summerhill. And in those days it was a boarding house and the verandas had been blocked off, and each room
Like
had
these wooden doors here were closed and cemented to the floor.
Yes,
And
the 3 folding
see on the
doors.
door there, they had deadlocks put on each of the doors.
So
It was let out as 10 room.
we bought it for 39,500, and it was so much bigger than our little place that
But
we
we
were.
sold the Carrington Street for, what was that?
We
28,000?
Yeah, we didn't have to pay too much more, but it was a reasonable sum, 39,500.
And at the time, nobody wanted the big houses, surprisingly.
Yeah, they
You
were
could sell a
wanting
little
little
house
ones.
very quickly.
And
But,
when we moved in, as I say, we were the youngest people, and we were the only ones who had
That's
children.
right.
And people said, "You're bringing up kids in Summerhill? For goodness sake, can't you do better than that?" Because everybody used it either as a temporary place before they went out to the suburbs, or they were people in boarding houses. But this place turned out to be very well built. It had good foundations, it had very solid wooden rafters and beams, and it was a lot of work to fix it up, but it responded well. We had, all the doors dipped to get all the
And
old
in
paint
those days,
off.
you do it yourself. There weren't workmen who knew what you wanted.
No,
They'd say,
no.
"Oh, you're pulling out the fireplaces and all this
Yeah,
sort of
they were
stuff."
good at turning these joints into modern places, but no good at restoring them. And even so, we've only been able to survive because we found good people who were able to do what we wanted and do the things we couldn't
Like
do.
keeping the sash windows going,
Yes, keeping the sash windows and
all that stuff.
fixing up leaks and all that sort of stuff. And I did it all myself. The worst job was the balcony off the top bedroom, because it was built on the floor joists that just came out,
From the bedroom.
but they'd all rotted, and it had been sort of shut off, because if you went out on it you'd have fallen through down onto the floor.
This makeshift kitchen has been turned into.
But it hadn't been used because the floorboards, the joists had rotted. So I looked at that and I thought the only way to fix this is to jack it up. So I bought an old flagpole,
Which is in the middle of that.
which you
window.
still see there. And the flagpole is so ornate that everybody thinks it's part of the house, but of course it wasn't. And with the flagpole I jacked the veranda up and then cut out the rotten timbers and put in new timbers and so on. So I made it sort of solid again, and we were able to use it. You had to do that sort of thing all over the place. But it responded well. It was basically well built, very solidly built, and therefore whatever you did to it came out more or less on top. A few things you can't do much about, like the stained marble fireplaces. But all the fireplaces
You
were...
see the stain because it's white.
They were still there. The cornices in the ceilings were still there. In other words, the owner had been very cheap. He just painted things over, but he hadn't got rid of anything.
And put fibro in front of the iron lace up the top, but we knew it was all still there. So
yeah, so our veranda is the only original veranda left in the street. All the rest have been replaced or patched up, and so on. But ours is still very good. And next door, their veranda started to fall down, and it was changed. The original owner, the father, used to sit out on the top balcony, and he didn't like people looking up through the lace at him. So he called the builder, and they got all the lace out and put fibro there and threw all the columns away and so on. And the people next door want to restore the balcony to look, and the council says it must be done to match the one next door. You can't just put a few lace fringes or anything like that. And they have not been able to find anybody who will do it. And it's extremely expensive because you've got to make all the chamfered columns, and you have to have dozens of pieces of lace, all of which have to match ours, and so nothing's been done. And you can go outside and have a look at what it is now. It's got a block of wood to hold it up, otherwise it would fall down. But we were so glad that the owners of this house had been cheap and hadn't really changed anything, so it could be made to look much like it must once have been,
Yes. It's beautiful, John. Well, how has Kensington Road changed since you moved here? You told us what it was like when you did move in.
Yes, they're all boarding houses. I mean, a couple of doors up, there was one that used to be a place for sailors who would come in when they're in town. And the cops were always coming. One day there was a girl banging on our door. People tried to rape her and all this sort of stuff. It was a sleazy neighbourhood. It had some good features. Opposite us was a little shop, and it had an awning over the footpath and a telephone next to it. And for years we never had a telephone box. We used to use the one over the road. And now the awning is gone and the telephone box is gone, and it just looks like an ordinary house.
We didn't have a telephone until 1982 in this house, and after I'd been told that my mother died in that phone box, I came home and ordered a telephone to be put in. Too late for her, of course.
Well, I didn't like the idea of
John
people ringing you and you have
and
to
it was
drop
very
what
handy
you were doing.
anyway. You could just pop over there and make a call.
Yeah,
Just
and
couldn't
in those
receive
days there were lots of corner stores because nobody had cars and they had to walk to get their stuff. So the idea of the little local shops flourished. Now they've all died. I think there's hardly any left. And somebody in the Annandale Historical Society was doing a study of that. I don't know whether they ever finished. The street, of course, had very little traffic then because not so many people used cars, whereas now it's got a fairly considerable amount of
but
traffic.
all those trucks used to come by.
Well, yes, the trucks used to come down Bogan Street because they didn't like the tight corner between Sloane and Grosvenor, so they'd tear down Bogan. But we stopped that when I got onto council because we blocked the street off, and in those days you could block the street off if the residents wanted it. The police had no veto, but they've now established a police veto, so you can't shut any more streets off. So Bogan Street is a memorial to those days. And I just took a survey of the street. They all said, yeah, we want it shut off. We don't want these trucks coming tearing down. So we shut it off. And it made it immediately a prime residential street.
It made it a decent footpath too. Remember, they were just little narrow footpaths over the
Yeah,
side.
and they put a verge in. The only thing was, set into the pavement was Bogan Street. And when they put the verges in, one side became bog and the other side became Gan. So they didn't really cut the verge to leave the street name in its way.
They had to keep putting the street sign up high because people used to steal the Bogan Street.
Yeah, that's right. They'd steal the street name.
But also we got broken into a lot of times.
Yeah, there were a lot of drug dependents here, and they would break into your house for drug money and things like that.
I've been told it was a height of the heroin epidemic, whatever you call it.
And there was a methadone clinic on the other side
That would
there.
have been like the late 70s.
Yeah,
early
so
90s.
it
So
was,
in the end, having resisted the thought of bars, we ended up with bars. I did try for, automatic, what do you call electronic alarm systems, but at the time, the three kids were young teenagers, I think, and still going in and out the front door a lot. I thought, they'd be going off all the time.
oh, they wouldn't put it in because
But then,
they had
yes, I got as far as having a man come to put it in, but
they wouldn't do it because there's solid brick walls.
They
You'd have had to.
don't realise
you
there's
know.
solid brick walls. So.
But the main change is that what was a boarding house slum has now become a respectable middle class area, and the street is now full of families. So there's young kids everywhere, and the parents are looking after the houses. A vast amount of money has been put into preserving the houses, and because Ashfield Council put a heritage order on it, that promoted it all. And the big danger now is that because Backflip Baird abolished the council, he only did that because he wanted to abolish the heritage zone, because he wants to build this freeway under Parramatta Road and have 10-storey apartment blocks looking down on it. So I suspect it might become a difficult area, and if that were the case, we'd have to leave.
Well, that brings us to the political area. What prompted your interest in politics, particularly local politics, John?
It was mainly conservation. I felt the area should have its character kept, because if you knock down all these old houses and stuck up these 3-storey walk-ups, there would be nothing to distinguish Summerhill from Campsie or any other place. And they were such poorly built, ugly blocks that it seemed a terrible shame. And not far from us in those days, there was a house. In my day, it was a hospital, St Lawrence Hospital. It was opposite the Summerhill Anglican Church, and it was a magnificent house. It had a huge L-shaped double veranda. It was owned by a team of doctors. It had been a private mansion, of course, and that's because it was on the top of the hill, and there were a series of mansions that were built down Smith Street. One is still left next to the park, and there's the remains of another one a bit further up, but all the rest have got knocked down. And St Lawrence Hospital, as I say, was owned by the doctors, and they'd turned it into a hospital, but they'd kept it looking as it was, and it had a beautiful garden, and it was all in very good condition. And the doctors then decided that the cost of keeping it as a hospital was getting too great because hospital standards kept going up. So they decided to auction it off to be sold, destroyed, and have flats put up instead. And that seemed to us such a terrible thing that we formed a resident action group that had as its main purpose to try and pressure the council into buying the house and doing something with it, And of course the council was weak-kneed in those days and wasn't very interested in conservation, so they didn't. And the house was knocked down. And then, when the council elections came up, the resident action group said to me, "Oh, well, you've got to stand as a councillor. We're sick of this council which is not interested in these things. We should, have some councillors who care for the area." So I put up as an ALP and as a conservationist, and that was enough to get a majority, so I got in. And in those days, me and John Merrick were the only two who were interested in keeping the houses much as they had been. And John Merrick eventually died. He was a haemophiliac, and that left just me. And the rest of the aldermen were appalling. You know, they were businessmen who just went on council because their friends said, oh, you ought to do that. They had no idea, and they had no policies, and they couldn't care less. But very gradually we worked at it, and eventually we ended up with 7 conservationists. And of course that was enough to decide who was to be mayor. And they said, John, you got to be our mayor. You're the oldest of us. You've been there longest. So, you know, and I thought, oh, that's terrible. Because in those days, Lou Herman had been mayor for 17 years and he wanted to create the record and be there for 19 years or whatever it was. But he was hopeless. He had no policies. He just treated the council money as his own and, you know, didn't spend it and just saved it. He was even worse than the Liberals because he was right-wing Labor. And, you know, the last thing you want is right-wing Labor. So we tossed him out and I became mayor. And he hated that, and his wife particularly hated it because she'd come to be First Lady of the district and did all her entertaining from the mayoress's room and so on and so on. So we then got the council to impose heritage orders and to put humps in the streets to stop the traffic.
Excuse me, John, what year was this that you became mayor?
Oh, what was it? I was there for about 14. Well, I finished in 1995. It was probably something like 1979 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Should know that better, but 79, 89. It was probably 1979. And gradually we got the council to do reasonable things and to put in pocket parks because we had far less park space than was reckoned good according to averages that had been worked out. And we got the cycle track put in along Hawthorn Canal with a federal government grant. And gradually the council became a major force in heritage, so that it put heritage zones on everything and, you know, all the worthwhile things. And this area was not perfect because it had a couple of 3-storey walk-ups, but not too many, and there were a lot of original houses. And that has paid off because people have repaired them, moved in, families are enjoying them and all that sort of thing. And in the end, I became quite a supporter of Ashfield Council. I thought they were, on the whole, doing a good job, and we had some very good aldermen. We had some rat bags. You always get rat bags on council. But, you know, there was enough good people. My neighbour Alex Loft succeeded me, and it became, I thought, a good council doing the things that ought to be done in an area like this. Because we are not an outer suburb, we are not a Campsie, we have a lot of good character buildings surviving from the Victorian era, and they are very beautiful buildings. They are 1,000 times nicer than the rubbish they put up instead. And a very good example of that is what happened in Haberfield. The Italians moved in, they had no sense of architectural design or anything, so they knocked over as many of the heritage, the Federation houses as they could, and turned them into brick monsters. And then they suddenly found they couldn't sell them because nobody wanted them. They wanted the old houses. So they realised they'd shot themselves in the foot. And fortunately, it's been stopped, and now Vince Crowe is doing a great job getting it being put on the National Register, and you know, it hopefully will survive. Although, of course, the state government has ruined a lot of it and will go on ruining a lot of it because the state government's hopeless. State governments should be abolished. There is no place for them. How could you possibly justify a political unit which went from Burke to Sydney? I mean, it's just absurd. And Earl Grey's regions that were proposed in the 1840s, of which the county of Cumberland is about the only one left, are the obvious way to go. But of course the state government's not going to abolish itself, so what can one do? But it is the big enemy.
Can you just briefly, you have mentioned some great achievements of your time on Ashfield Council in terms of conservation and the bike paths and so on. Any other highlights of your time on Ashfield Council you'd like to mention?
Well, closing the Bogan Street, I think, was a great thing, particularly as it could be done in those days. And I suppose those things you mentioned are the main things, because once one realised where the council should be going and one found that it was in fact going in that area, then you became very enthusiastic, you know, and the big battle to put in the road humps was a good example. The car owners all said, "Oh, I've spent a lot of money on my cars, I don't want to have them bumped over these bumps." But the speeds of the cars in the local streets in which children played, because there's no parks nearby, was too great. So things like that took up your interest, and I suppose the things I enjoyed most were getting through things that I thought were good and that I'd stood for. And I had no trouble getting elected every year because, first of all, I stood for the ALP, and secondly, I stood for conservation. And there were always enough people under those two headings to put you in. So I never had to do what this particular resident wanted or that particular resident wanted, whereas the other councillors were hopeless. You know, we'd just pass a law saying anybody who parked a car on the verge would be fined. And then their friend would park a car on the verge and they'd come up and say, "Oh, well, you know, he's a friend of mine, we shouldn't be charging him," you know. They had no principle at all, and I didn't like the way they operated, and that caused a bit of tension and so on. So I suppose the highlights were going down the path you thought the suburb should go, and finding that it was going down that path. You know, that was very satisfying. Very few politicians can get into power and then do what they want. And look at poor Obama. You know, he couldn't do half the things he wanted. Whereas at a local level, eventually we could, because we had a majority, you know.
Well, let's go on finally to your role as a founder of the Ashfield and District Historical Society.
Right, yes. I suppose I've always felt that a historical society was an important thing, because it's no good having a council doing this or that if the populace are not interested. You know, you've got to make people aware that they are living in a rather special suburb and that they should want to keep it the way it is and to work in that direction. And years ago, June Jury and I decided that we really needed a historical society here. And I wrote an article about this in the journal, so it's got the hard facts on the subject. And we had some very good people in those days, Nora Peake and others, Gwen Gardner, who were people who'd lived their life as sellers in shops and so on, but who, when they retired, were able to get the education and get an interest in the things they wanted to do. And they became very, very well-informed and keen supporters of this issue. And so I've forgotten the details, but we must have sent out notices and things like that and gathered together those people who were interested in these things and set ourselves up as a historical society. And we used to meet in the old School of Arts in Liverpool Road, on the top floor of it. Very noisy place, but it was a historic building, and it still had bits of an old library and the billiard tables and things of that sort. And I was the first treasurer, and I had to be careful because as an alderman, if I was too closely related to the Historical Society, they would make me stand out of any debate on something put forward by the Historical Society. So I soon relinquished offices and could claim, therefore, to stay in the debate and speak in favour of the Society. So it was just nice having a group that was supportive and could then put little bits of pressure on the council, and it's subsequently gone to great strengths, mainly because of the enormous dedication of people like Anne O'Connell and Chris Pratton and the others, David Rollinson and so on, because these are intelligent and well-informed members of the community who devote vast amounts of their private time and their personal skills to this subject, and they presumably do it because they think it's important and it's interesting, and the community is very lucky to have such intelligent and well-informed people to do this work, and it's always hard to get enough people to take the main offices at each AGM, but it's got to be done, I think, because it becomes a community support structure for the things the council is doing. So of the two things, you've got to get the council moving down the right paths, and then you got to try and make the public keen and aware of that. And you're never entirely successful because the public is full of rat bags and people who couldn't care less and so on. But I think in Ashfield we've done quite a good job on those two points. And I think the journal, which is published, is one of the finest publications in the area of local history that you could ask for. I mean, it's got marvellous stuff, and because of Anne, it also concentrates on forgotten women who might otherwise not get a showing, you know. And I've had a bit to do at the Marrickville Society, and of course they don't have a journal. They put out a couple of books, Marrickville, A Past Worth Preserving and so on, but they don't really have a journal. And when all else fails, your journals are there. And largely because of Chris Pratton and Anne, we've done exceptionally well there. And all their stuff is excellent, first class, worth reading, instructive, and tells you about the lost past, which was very different and very hard to recover because all the newspapers are gone, the Aeroplane Press and the Ashfield Advertiser, all those old newspapers, they're not around, nobody keeps them. The government gazettes, of which we had a good set, the council has thrown away, you know, years ago. So the Historical Society, I think, is very important at keeping these things much closer to the public attention than would be the case without them, you know.
John, as president of the Ashfield and District Historical Society, what do you think is the role of the Society and of local historical societies in general in the future?
Well, that's going to be hard because the council, which was the other half of the equation, is now gone. And the present council is useless. It's too big, it's got no interest in particular areas, there are no aldermen, you know, it's a disaster. And that will leave the community effort more or less by itself. And I'm not sure how that'll work. As a president, I'm a bit hopeless because I don't actually do the local history. I don't write the articles and do the hard work, you know, I occasionally do a walk or something like that. But nobody wanted to be president, and it seemed to me that one should keep the show rolling, and therefore I took on the job. My friend Brian Taylor, who's in the Bibliographical Society, the same thing happened to him, but he wouldn't take the presidency on, so he became acting president for about 5 years. Well, that struck me as a bit stupid. So, but I mean, the question of the future is very difficult to assess, and a lot depends on whether the new council will abolish the heritage areas or not. Now, their stand on West Connex is pretty hopeless. They say they're opposed to it, but they do nothing, because they were put there to get rid of the opposition to West Connex. So they're not going to do anything, and it's a dictator anyway, and as I say, there are no aldermen. And a lot depends on who gets elected from this area when they do finally have some elections, as I suppose they will at some stage. But I think there's a big question mark over it all now, and that the very good relationship between Ashfield Council and the local historical society was getting a lot done. After all, we're in Thurning Villa, one of the most historic houses in the district, because the council gives it to us for $1 a year or $1 a week or some piffling sum. Now, at the moment, that's continuing because Ashfield Council is still there, even though it's not a council anymore. The building and the people are still there. But the future, I think, has a big question mark hanging over it. And I fear the worst, but I can't say what will happen. And as to the effect of the abolition of the council on the community movement, I'm not sure what effect that will have. It won't affect the current members. They're still very dedicated and intelligent. But when their time comes, and it's a question of replacing them, there may be not enough impulse in the community to successfully do that. So it's a shame, after all the work we've done, to have it all reduced to a big fat question mark.
Professor John O. Ward, President of the Ashfield and District Historical Society, thank you very much for contributing to the Society's oral archive.
Well, thank you very much for making it possible, and for putting these probing questions which make you think about things you may not normally think about and find answers that you would otherwise not come to. So I think it's very good that the Society is moving into these oral histories, and I wish some of the inhabitants of this street who were here when I first came could have done this, because Teddy Edwards up the road, she said she remembered when this road wasn't even made, and there were herds of sheep and steers walking down Parramatta Road. That's the way it was then, and it would have been nice to have all that put on record too. So I think it's a good move, and thank you both very much for going to the trouble.
Indeed. I should also refer to the voices you have heard were those of Professor John O. Ward, his wife, Gail Ward, and the interviewer Bernadette Williamson.
Thank you, Bernadette.